How's it going?
Well, good evening, and welcome to our Friday night Bible study. The opening words you heard were a response to my prompt. Here we go.
Where
So,
are we going?
yeah. Well, we're not going to Florida today. Some of you may be aware that overnight Florida got hit with a Category 4 hurricane. The hurricane came ashore officially up in what's called the Big Bend region of Florida, where the land bends from the panhandle down to the peninsula portion of the state. And so it hit Tallahassee pretty hard. But it was along the coast, the western coast of Florida. So cities like Sarasota, Tampa Bay, and Cedar Springs, these places along the west coast of Florida, got pretty heavily hit. And I spent a little time this morning uh, online watching some of the Florida area television stations' coverage of the aftermath of the hurricane. The Rays vertical sign in front of the Rays Stadium in St. Petersburg. They're the Tampa Bay Rays, but their stadium is in St. Petersburg. Got knocked over by the wind during the night. They showed a row on Treasure Island, which is one of the barrier islands along the western coast of Florida, showed where the boats from the docks out behind a whole bunch of very high-end houses had been lifted up by the storm surge, and just a whole row of them sitting in the front yards of the associated houses. There was another place where one of their reporters was in a park. This was in the Sarasota area, and there was a boat that had washed ashore, and what kept it going farther up into the park was a big tree that it ran into side first, and that stopped it. And then when the water washed out, there sat the boat on the ground leaning up against the tree. A lot of people without power in Florida. They had a reporter by a staging area that Duke Energy had set up for crews to go out and start working on things. This was just as it was turning light. And by the way, this is for Friday, September the 27th of 2024. So you'll know that the hurricane we speak of is Hurricane Helene. They even had pictures from sister stations up in Atlanta of flooding in the Atlanta area because the storm came in line, just kept moving northward and got through Georgia up into the Atlanta area and created a lot of extra rain and therefore flooding in Atlanta. So that's kind of the craziness of living on this planet that's been interfered with and does not work according to God's creative design. God created this world to work properly and to have regulated climatic and weather systems. And when sin came around and humans started looking out for themselves and the rest of nature started looking out for itself, changes were made that caused these destructive patterns that weren't there according to the Creator's design. These things are the natural result of the process that we call sin, which is anything that's outside of the Creator's plan and design for life. So, rather than, I think, yammer on about a whole bunch of other stuff that's not that important, maybe what we should do is begin and we'll get into our study of the Scriptures. So let's bow our heads. Our Father in heaven, we thank you that we have the blessing of your written word. We thank you that you have the blessing of your watch, care, and protection. And our hearts go out to people who have lost power or housing, or in some cases even their lives, to these destructive weather systems. We know who to blame for that, and it's not you. That the insurance industry is wrong when it calls these things acts of God. And so, as we study from the Word today, now we ask that the Spirit will draw close to each person, and we might properly understand the things we read. And we ask this all in Jesus' name. Amen. Now, last week we kind of covered an entire book, because last week we abandoned the verse-by-verse reading for most things, particularly in that book. And we did present this table. And let me switch to this view so you can see the table. And we talked about the offerings in the first 7 or 8 chapters of the book of Leviticus. And one of the things we had, one of the columns in our table, was disposition of blood. And we may not have been very clear on why we made that an issue. Those of you with a Seventh-day Adventist background are probably aware that the Adventist Church owes its existence to the Millerite movement of the first half of the 19th century, of the 1830s and 40s. William Miller was one who predicted, based on his interpretation of the book of Daniel, that Jesus would come sometime in 1843 or 1844. They later adjusted it to 1844 because they recognized that the calculations were based on standard numbering, with there being a year zero, and there was no year zero when we transitioned from before the Common Era to Common Era years, so that actually instead of 1843 CE, we should have calculated 1844 CE. The Adventist Church, the Seventh-day Adventist Church in particular, differs from other movements based on Millerism in that they came up with an interpretation of the passage in Daniel that Miller had kind of fastened his carriage to, because Miller had read this passage in Daniel 8:14. It says, "Unto 2,300 days, then shall the sanctuary be cleansed." The sanctuary represents the human soul. We are God's church. We are His temple, the New Testament tells us. But there was a belief widely held in Miller's day that the sanctuary represented the earth. And so Miller's thinking, well, when is the earth cleansed except by fire at the second coming? And so he said, well, then that means that the second coming, the time for the second coming, has been predicted right here. He was wrong, of course, but he said that. And so there were people who waited up in 1844 that didn't harvest their crops and so forth, waiting for Jesus to come. And here we are 180 years later next month, and clearly Jesus didn't come then because he didn't come yet. So
I need you to come in here for a moment.
okay, let me pause this just a moment. Okay, got that matter taken care of. We were talking about this idea of William Miller and when he thought the sanctuary would be cleansed. What made the Seventh-day Adventist interpretation unique was that they said that the sanctuary wasn't on earth, the sanctuary was in heaven. And they based that in part on their interpretation of some verses in the book of Hebrews. And that there's either a literal or figurative building in heaven, in which there are the same kind of apartments, and that the focus of Jesus' ministry moved from one to the other on that date in 1844. Well, then there's the long discussion of what actually changed and what significance does that have for us. And I was raised in the Adventist system. I was in university when Desmond Ford brought up his ideas that, what happened in 1844 wasn't significant. That doesn't really mean anything, that we need to look elsewhere for significance to that. And well, obviously, if you're in an organization whose very existence is focused on that interpretation, that's not going to go over very well. Desmond Ford may not be around anymore, but I know he did maintain a teaching ministry outside the Adventist church after he essentially got kicked out for teaching what he taught. And I also mentioned last week that the idea of what's going on in the sanctuary that was taught to me when I was in high school was the transfer of guilt interpretation. The sinner laid his hands on the head of the animal and confessed his sin. The text tells us that the sinner was to lay their hands on the head. It doesn't say anything about confessing. It just says lay your hands on the animal's head and then slaughter it. But anyway, so you transferred your guilt to the animal. The guilt was in the blood because the life was in the blood. And then the transfer of the blood into the apartment of the first apartment of the sanctuary, where it's sprinkled on the altar of burnt offering and on the veil that divided the two apartments of that inner sanctuary. And then on the Day of Atonement, that was cleansed through the sacrifices and procedures of that yearly festival. And so Adventists would teach that from 1844 forward, the earth was in what they would call the antitypical Day of Atonement. The typical Day of Atonement was the yearly service that the Hebrews observed. Jesus was the antitypical sacrifice, and then the antitypical Day of Atonement, according to the church, began in 1844. And years later, when I was out of college and was doing graduate work and teaching, we had a pastor come through who had been at what is now Southern University, and he and some friends had studied through this section of Leviticus, and they had paid close attention to which offerings had the blood of the sacrifice taken inside the apartments of the sanctuary. And as we saw last week, as we went through this, if you go down, these unintentional and unknown sins, these three columns that I'm kind of running my cursor across here might be a little hard to see, but if I had, they're showing you the caret instead of the pointer cursor, so it's harder to see there. But in those three rows, those were the ones where the blood was sprinkled on the curtain and on the horns of the incense altar. So then the Adventist interpretation was, according to him, that it was these unintentional sins that God began to deal with in 1844. And of course, then his idea was keeping the Sabbath was one of those unknown sins. People were worshiping on Sunday because that's what the church told them to do. They didn't know any better. So it was an unknown sin. And by having the Adventist church come along and restore worship on the seventh day of the week, then God was dealing with that unknown sin. Again, all of that founded on a penal substitution, transfer of guilt orientation. But if we look at salvation differently, if we look at God not dealing with the guilt, but rather dealing with the sin itself, then the interpretation changes but the symbol remains the same. If we are doing something and we recognize that we have a character defect that makes us do that thing, then we're open to God dealing with that right then. God can begin to change us because we see it, we're astounded at how vile we are, and we go to Him for help. And if we go to Him for help, He's willing to offer that help. But what if there's something going on, because we're human, we don't realize the selfishness inherent in our motives and aims, and we do these things thinking they're the right thing, but in fact, they're still contaminated by faulty character, then that's a different issue for God to deal with, because we're not aware of it, and we're not prepared to submit that aspect of our character to His control, to His manipulation and purification of us. And so in those situations, then, the process of dealing with that sin and purifying us of that sin takes longer, because God has to wait until we're aware of it. And then, and so then it makes sense that the process of dealing with that by carrying the blood around is a longer term process than what was the case in, say, a known sin here at the bottom column, where it's just dealt with right there at the altar of burnt offering. Or as that pastor would tell us, when we know what our sin is, then we confess it and it's dealt with right there at the cross. So that's kind of why we did that, and I don't think we made that entirely clear last week. So let's switch over. We did kind of finish, and I brought up the wrong thing there. We did kind of finish the book of Numbers. We didn't really read through the procedures on the Day of Atonement. Now, we did talk about this at the time, and that is, we talked about there's the Lord's goat and there's Azazel. So there was a goat offered as a sin offering for the sin of the entire community, and its blood was taken into the most holy place to make atonement for the sins of the people throughout the year. And this was a yearly thing. And it was a yearly thing in part because of what happened with Aaron's sons Nadab and Abihu, as we read last week. So one of the things that I didn't mention, but that we have mentioned, I think we mentioned it when we were in the book of Hebrews, is what does Azazel, that second goat, represent? The goat that the priest laid his hands on in the transfer of guilt method, therefore transferring the sins onto the head of that goat, and then that goat was carried alive into the wilderness and abandoned there by the hand of a man suited for the purpose, or the hands of a fit man, I think is as the King James renders that. And there is an interpretation in which Azazel represents Satan. But Azazel is specifically the goat of removal. The sins were removed. And if we're not talking about guilt, but actual sin, then the goat of removal represented the removal of sin from the population. And in our day, each of us individually. So for us, in the antitypical Day of Atonement, the goat represents whatever it is that takes the sin out of us and removes it away to a place. And I have suggested in the past that that also represents Jesus Christ, because it is Jesus who purifies us. The blood of Jesus Christ, his Son, cleanses us or purifies us from all sin, John wrote. So Jesus is the purifier. He's the remover. And, well, someone might ask, well, why two goats? Well, one of the goats was killed so that its blood could be offered. And God wasn't in the business of resurrecting goats. But when the Lamb of God died for our sins, God did resurrect him. And now he is available to be active in our lives and to remove our sin. At any rate, that kind of gets us through the book of Leviticus and whatever we might be able to gain from what it teaches us. And clearly we're taking it all metaphorically. There's no significance in our day to animal sacrifices. There are those who will interpret the Old Testament suggest that in order for the end of time to arrive, that the Jews have to be allowed to resume animal sacrifices on the Temple Mount there in Jerusalem, which is currently controlled by Muslims, and it is the site is one of their holy sites, because for them it's the place where Ishmael was offered as a sacrifice. They have Ishmael instead of Isaac, so that's their version of the story. And we're not going to sit here and get critical about who's right and who's wrong. We're probably all wrong, so that's just the situation that is there, and some people are expecting that, and we're saying Jesus can come when Jesus wants to come, and whether or not there are animal sacrifices on the Temple Mount makes no difference to him. It's all just symbol and ceremony. So, in Numbers chapter 1, this version titles this Registration of Israel's Troops. Well, we're going to argue that this wasn't an issue of troops at this point, although the people may have seen it that way. A year after Israel's departure from Egypt, the Lord spoke to Moses in the tabernacle, or that footnote will tell us, in the tent of meeting, in the wilderness of Sinai, on the first day of the second month, so we're into April or early May, that's what footnote B will tell us, of that year. He said, from the whole community of Israel, record the names of all the warriors by their clans and families. And I just want to look at that and see if a more literal version uses the term warriors there. And the reason for that is that I know this version to be highly interpretive, and that may be the interpretation that they gave of it. Taking the sum of all the congregation of the children of Israel after their families by the house of their fathers, with a number of their names, every male by their polls. So from 20 years old and upward, all that are able to go forth to war in Israel, thou and Aaron shall number them by their armies. So verse 3 is where you get the idea of going to war, and that's why apparently they put the term warrior there in verse 2 as well. Who put that bit about warriors there? Was that maybe something that Moses did once the people did what we're going to read later on in the book of Numbers that they did, and thwarted what God intended to do? At any rate, list all the men 20 years old or older who are able to go to war. You and Aaron must register the troops, and you will be assisted by one family leader from each tribe. These are the tribes and the names of the leaders who will assist you. From Reuben, Elazar, son of Shadur. Simeon, Shalumiel, son of Zurishaddai. Judah, Nashon, son of Amminadab. Issachar, Nathanael, son of Zuar. Now you'll notice here that we're going through the sons in the order that they're mentioned in the book of Genesis, but we've already skipped the tribe of Levi, because that's the tribe of priests, and I think you'll find they're not to be counted. So then you get Issachar, Nathanael, son of Zuar. Zebulun, Eliab, son of Helon. Ephraim, son of Joseph. Elishama, son of Ammihud. Manasseh, son of Joseph. Gamaliel, son of Pedazur. And apparently my wife got hung up on, so she wants to rejoin us. You there?
Yeah, hi, sorry about that.
Oh, I forgot. I couldn't hear you because I didn't get you on speaker. There, I think.
Said hi, sorry about that.
Okay, well, you're here now, so we're going to get 12 tribes by mentioning Joseph twice, once by Ephraim, once by Manasseh. Benjamin, Abidan, son of Gideoni; Dan, Ahiezer, son of Ammishaddai; Asher, Pagiel, son of Ochran; Gad, Eliasaph, son of Deuel; and Naphtali, Ahira, son of Enan. So there are the 12. See, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. There's the 12 tribes. And because Levi is left out, Joseph is divided based on his two sons, Ephraim and Manasseh. And we read about that in the book of Genesis, when Joseph brought his sons to his father for his father to bless them. And he crossed his hands, even though Joseph had arranged that his oldest son would be on Joseph's left and therefore on his father's right. But you'll notice now that Ephraim is mentioned first, even though he was the younger of the two. These are the chosen leaders of the community, the leaders of the ancestral tribes, the heads of the clans of Israel. So Moses and Aaron called together these chosen leaders, and they assembled the whole community of Israel on that very day. That would be on the first day of the second month. See chapter 1, verse 1. Yeah. And all the people were registered according to their ancestry by their clans and families, and this is part of the reason why genealogy is such a big deal with the Jews. That's how they were counted. That's how they did their census, because that's essentially what we're reading here, is a census of the people. The men of Israel who were 20 years old or older were listed one by one, just as the Lord commanded Moses. So Moses recorded their names in the wilderness of Sinai. This is the number of men 20 years old or older who were able to go to war, as their names were listed in the records of their clans and families. So again, we're going to go through this list. Reuben, Jacob's eldest son, 46,500. Simeon, 59,300. Gad, 45,650. Judah, 74,600. That's the highest number we've seen so far. Issachar, 54,400. Zebulun, 57,400. Ephraim, 40,500. That's the next lowest number. The lowest number then is Manasseh, son of Joseph, 32,200. Now here's an odd one. Benjamin. When they went in, Benjamin had more sons than all the others, but already you're seeing the difference in the population, so that out of Benjamin, only 35,400 are listed. Dan, 62,700. That looks like the second highest out of all of them. Asher, 41,500. And Naphtali, 53,400. And if you add up the clans of Joseph, you would come out to 72,700. So even then, Judah would be bigger than the entire clan of Joseph. Just to process the numbers a little bit and relate them to each other. So these were the men registered by Moses and Aaron and the 12 leaders of Israel, all listed according to their ancestral descent. They were registered by families, all the men of Israel who were 20 years old or older and able to go to war. The total number was 603,550. So, males 20 years old or older, 603,000, and that's where we get the number of between 1 million and 1.5 million, because if you count the women and children, those males under 20 years of age, you're obviously going to have more than double this 603,550. But this total did not include the Levites. For the Lord had said to Moses, "Do not include the tribe of Levi in the registration, Do not count them with the rest of the Israelites. Put the Levites in charge of the tabernacle of the covenant, along with all its furnishings and equipment. They must carry the tabernacle and all its furnishings as you travel, and they must take care of it and camp around it. Whenever it is time for the tabernacle to move, the Levites will take it down, and when it is time to stop, they will set it up again. But any unauthorized person who goes too near the tabernacle must be put to death. Each tribe of Israel will camp in a designated area with its own family banner. But the Levites will camp around the tabernacle of the covenant to protect the community of Israel from the Lord's anger. The Levites are responsible to stand guard around the tabernacle. And we've talked a little bit about this. That does sound rather draconian of God. You got to have these buffer between me or you, or I'm going to kill you all. That's the perception I think a lot of people had, even in Israel at the time, and so therefore a lot of people still have that perception today. But we have suggested that the protection is because we are not suited to approach the presence of God because of our sinfulness, and until we have been purified through the blood of Christ, the presence of God is not safe for us. Not because he's angry and vengeful and vicious and ready to destroy anything that he doesn't like, but just because the purity of his character is such that that is its effect. God is truth and reality. And in our state, we're not prepared for truth and reality. And as we discussed last week, and I forgot to print that out again. I had a Bible answer that I did last week. I didn't get it printed out, and I forgot to get it printed out now. So I don't have it. We won't get to go through that tonight. But anyway, it did talk about that. And the idea that the rider on the white horse in Revelation 19 kills the nations with the sword out of his mouth. Well, he is described there in Revelation 19 as faithful and true. What comes from the mouth of someone who's faithful and true, unless it's words of truth. And when Jesus comes to earth and speaks truth in a form that it can no longer be denied, then those whose lives are out of harmony with truth cannot bear up under it, and they are slain. At any rate, it says, verse 54, so the Israelites did everything just as the Lord had commanded Moses. We've read that line a whole bunch in the book of Exodus. Then the Lord gave these instructions to Moses and Aaron, and this is something that some people will make a big deal about, the arrangement of the tribes in their camps. When the Israelites set up camp, each tribe will be assigned its own area. The tribal divisions will camp beneath their family banners on all four sides of the tabernacle or the tent of meeting, but at some distance from it. The divisions of Judah, Issachar, and Zebulun are to camp toward the sunrise on the east side of the tabernacle beneath their family banners. These are the names of the tribes, their leaders, and the numbers of their registered troops. And these are essentially the same numbers that we already read. So, the east side of the camp include Judah, Issachar, and Zebulun. And those numbers are right there out of the first chapter. Total of all troops on Judah's side of the camp is 186,400. These three tribes are to lead the way whenever the Israelites travel to a new campsite. The divisions of Reuben, Simeon, and Gad are to camp on the south side of the tabernacle beneath their family banners. These are the names of the tribes, their leaders, and the numbers of their registered troops. And again, that comes right out of the first chapter. And so the total of all the troops on Reuben's side of the camp is 151,450. These three tribes will be second in line whenever the Israelites travel. Then the tabernacle, carried by the Levites, will set out from the middle of the camp. All the tribes are to travel in the same order that they camp, each in position under the appropriate family banner. The divisions of Ephraim, Manasseh, and Benjamin are to camp on the west side of the tabernacle. That would be a much smaller group, because we already saw that those tribes were lower in number. And those, of course, are the descendants of Rachel, rather than all the others being the descendants of Leah. These are the names of the tribes, their leaders, and the numbers of the registered troops. And again, that's right out of chapter 1. And so the total of all the troops on Ephraim's side of the camp is 108,100. We're still over 100,000, even with those much smaller numbers. These three tribes will be third in line whenever the Israelites travel, although they will be behind the Levites and the folded up sanctuary. The divisions of Dan, Asher, and Naphtali are to camp on the north side of the tabernacle. Beneath their family banners, see the names of the tribes, their leaders, and the numbers of the registered troops. And so we have those numbers again right out of chapter 1. The total of all the troops on Dan's side of the camp is 157,600. These three tribes will be last, marching under their banners whenever the Israelites travel. In summary, the troops of Israel listed by their families total 603,550, same number out of the first chapter. But as the Lord had commanded, the Levites were not included in this registration. So the people of Israel did everything as the Lord had commanded Moses. Each clan and family set up camp and marched under their banners exactly as the Lord has instructed them. Now, when I was in college, one of the classes I took, I think it was my junior year class. The first year I took a 5-credit course, Life of Christ, under Smuts Van Rooyen. The second year I took I forget the exact name of the class, but it was taught by a professor that had come from California. He'd been at PUC. I can see his face right now, and I can't think of his name, but I had been introduced to some of his work before I started college, and so I thought it would be interesting to take a class from him. I knew about Smuts Van Rooyen because his father-in-law was the doctor at Eden Valley in Colorado when I was a student there, and so he had come through at one point and sat through my Sabbath school class, and so I knew who he was. That's kind of why I signed up for his class when I got started. Then my junior year, I took Studies in the Sanctuary by Daniel Waterhouse, and that's the class I'm going to discuss. In my final year was Studies in the New Testament with a professor who had taken classes with my dad when my dad was a student there so many years earlier. Again, I can see his face, can't come up with his name right now. I'd have to go look at my books. But so those were the 4 classes that I took in religion when I went to college. But the class that Daniel Waterhouse taught was kind of fascinating for me because he's the one that revealed to me that a lot of the structure and symbolism in that sanctuary came right out of the worship practices of the people of Egypt. And he showed how the structures matched, and it was all kind of interesting. And one of the things that he talked about was the arrangement of the camps, and he linked that to the descriptions in Ezekiel and other places of the 4 cherubim, or in different places, the cherubim with 4 places. So you have the face of the man, the face of the bull, the face of the eagle, and the face of the lion. And we have generally associated the lion, that would be to the east, with Judah, because the Bible talks about the lion of the tribe of Judah. And then he also pointed out that the sanctuary is between the lion and the ox, and between the eagle and the man. And the man was associated with the tribes, I think, to the south, but maybe to the north. And then the eagle would be associated with those on the north and south. I forget which. Anyway, he had that all laid out and showed it, and we had diagrams, and I probably still have my syllabus somewhere hidden away. Take me forever to find and dig it out, but that was all kind of interesting. But ultimately, we have to ask the question, What spiritual significance is to that? What can we learn from it? And I'm not prepared to tell you that at this point. There are those who will tell you that you need to learn your tribal identity, and that will then tell you something about.
I've heard you can't go to heaven unless you know which door to enter.
Yeah, yeah. I think that's kind of a stretch. That's kind of a human interpretation of what's there. I think the idea of the symbolism in Revelation of the gates and the foundations and all is that heaven will be all inclusive. It doesn't matter who you are, where you come from, what your personality type is. Salvation, heaven, eternal life is available to everyone. God is able to save anyone who wants it. Doesn't matter where you come from. Doesn't matter your genealogy or so forth. All these things are available to us, to all of us, anyone who wants it. And that's why the Bible talks about whosoever heareth.
What it is you're wanting.
Well, yeah.
Are you wanting to go to a place where God's going to do something to injure your enemy? Or do you want to go to a place where God's going to do something to heal your enemy and fix
make
it
him your friend?
No longer be enemies, but become possibly good friends.
Oh. Mm-hmm. Right. So we're trying to go through this numbering bit, and that's why the book is called the Book of Numbers. I clicked that next, it didn't go there. Now it went. Because of its limited value, maybe somebody who's really into these kinds of things can study them and can study personality types and suggest various variations thereof. There are theories out there of 4 basic personality types. Some of you may have heard the choleric, phlegmatic, there's 2 more. Sanguine, and there's another one. I can't remember right now. What? Melancholic. Choleric, melancholic, phlegmatic, and sanguine. There's 4 basic personality types. And if you can mix those with 3 other fundamental personality traits, you'd end up with 12. And so there's 4 sides with 3 tribes in each camp, blah, blah, blah. I don't know. There could be some significance to that. I have not spent a lot of time educating myself on that. I'm not going to posit an interpretation here because that would be just speculation on my part. That's not very valuable. This is the family line of Aaron and Moses as it was recorded when the Lord spoke to Moses on Mount Sinai. The names of Aaron's sons were Nadab, the oldest, Abihu, Eleazar, and Ithamar. These sons of Aaron were anointed to be and ordained to minister as priests, but Nadab and Abihu died in the Lord's presence in the wilderness of Sinai when they burned incense before the Lord, the wrong kind of fire, different than he had commanded. Since they had no sons, this left only Eleazar and Ithamar to serve as priests with their father Aaron. Then the Lord said to Moses, call forward the tribe of Levi and present them to Aaron the priest to serve as his assistants. They will serve Aaron and the whole community, performing their sacred duties in and around the tabernacle. They will also maintain all the furnishings of the sacred tent, serving in the tabernacle on behalf of all the Israelites. So in other words, they were selected to be servants. They were to serve the entire community. And that's how they were set apart. They weren't set about to be more important, except as they served. Remember, the greater served the lesser. So that is the sense in which the Levites were greater than the rest of the Israelites because they served them by performing their duties in the tabernacle.
And in our world today, angels serve humans, but because of our fallen state, if we make it to heaven, then we will be elevated beyond angels because we will have experienced something that they didn't experience. And that will put us in the position of being able to serve angels.
Yeah. If in fact, and there are theories out there that, the book of Hebrews says that mankind was created a little lower than the angels, but some people have suggested that that gets reversed after the restoration of all things. But if then we're greater than the angels, then we'll serve the angels, because when the angels were greater than us, they served us, according to the book of Hebrews. But anyway, assign the Levites to Aaron and his sons. They've been given from among all the people of Israel to serve as their assistants. Appoint Aaron and his sons to carry out the duties of the priesthood, but any unauthorized person who goes too near the sanctuary must be put to death. And the Lord said to Moses, Look, I have chosen the Levites from among the Israelites to serve as substitutes for all the firstborn sons of the people of Israel. The Levites belong to me, for all the firstborn males are mine. On the day I struck down all the firstborn sons of the Egyptians, I set apart for myself all the firstborn in Israel, both of people and of animals. They are mine. I am Yahweh. The Lord spoke again to Moses in the wilderness of Sinai. He said, Record the names of the members of the tribe of Levi by their families and clans. List every male who is 1 month old or older. So this would be a more inclusive census because it would start with males who were 1 month old or older, and that may have been in part because of a higher rate of infant mortality in that time of reduced medical technology. So they had to wait till the child was 1 month old before counting it, because otherwise it was too uncertain if it would survive. So Moses listed them just as the Lord had commanded. Levi had 3 sons whose names were Gershon, Kohath, and Merari. And we'll read those 3 names repeatedly as we go through the duties of the Levites. Those were their 3 divisions. The clans descended from Gershon were named after 2 of his descendants, Libni and Shimei. The clans descended from Kohath were named after 4 of his descendants, Amram, Izhar, Hebron, and Uzziel. And of course we know Amram was the father of Moses and Aaron, so Moses and Aaron were Kohathites. The clans descended from Merari were named after 2 of his descendants, Mali and Mushi. These were the Levite clans listed according to their family groups. So we have 8 family groups there in 3 divisions. The descendants of Gershon were composed of the clans descended from Libni and Shimei. There were 7,500 males 1 month old or older among these Gershonite clans. They were assigned the area to the west of the tabernacle for their camp. The leader of the Gershonite clans was Eliasaph, son of Lael. These 2 clans were responsible to care for the tabernacle, including the sacred tent with its layers of coverings, the curtain at its entrance, the curtains of the courtyard that surrounded the tabernacle and altar, the curtain at the courtyard entrance, the ropes, and all the equipment related to their use. The descendants of Kohath were composed of the clans descended from Amram, Izhar, Hebron, and Uzziel. There were 8,600 males 1 month old or older among these Kohathite clans. They were responsible for the care of the sanctuary, and they were assigned the area south of the tabernacle for their camp. So Gershon were assigned west, Kohath south. The descendants of Merari, the leaders of the Kohathite clans were Elazaphan, son of Uzziel. These 4 clans were responsible for the care of the ark, the table, the lampstand, the altars, the various articles used in the sanctuary, the inner curtain, all the equipment related to their use. So the inner rooms, because they were more closely related to the priest. Eleazar, son of Aaron, the priest, was the chief administrator over all the Levites, with special responsibility for oversight of the sanctuary. The descendants of Merari were composed of the clans descended from Mali and Mushi. There were 6,200 males 1 month old or older among these Merarite clans. They were assigned the areas north of the tabernacle for their camp. The leader of the Merarite clans was Zuriel, son of Abihail. These two clans were responsible for the care of the frames supporting the tabernacle, the crossbars, the pillars, the bases, and all the equipment related to their use. They were also responsible for the posts of the courtyard and all their bases, pegs, and ropes. So they were kind of the heavy lifters, you might think. The area in front of the tabernacle in the east toward the sunrise was reserved for the tents of Moses and of Aaron and his sons, who had the final responsibility for the sanctuary on behalf of the people of Israel. Anyone other than a priest or Levite who went to near the sanctuary was to be put to death. So you have the three clans around the south, west, and north, and then Moses and Aaron and their people out to the east. When Moses and Aaron counted the Levite clans at the Lord's command, the total number was 22,000 males 1 month old or older, and that would suggest that of all the clans, Levi was the least numerous because they had a more extensive count. Instead of starting at 20 and counting upward, they're starting at 1 month and counting upward, and they only came up with 22,000. So that would have been by far the smallest of the tribes. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Now count all the firstborn sons in Israel who are 1 month old or older, and make a list of their names. The Levites must be reserved for me as substitutes for the firstborn sons of Israel. And take the livestock of the Levites as substitutes for the firstborn livestock of the people of Israel. The Levites belong to me. I am Yahweh. There are 273 more firstborn sons of Israel than there are Levites. To redeem these extra firstborn sons, collect 5 pieces of silver for each of them, each piece weighing the same as the sanctuary shekel, which equals 20 gerahs. Give the silver to Aaron and his sons as the redemption price for the extra firstborn son." So, there was this small number, 273 more firstborn sons, 22,273. So they had to give an offering to redeem those extra firstborn sons. So Moses collected the silver for redeeming the firstborn sons of Israel, who exceeded the number of Levites. He collected 1,365 pieces of silver on behalf of these firstborn sons of Israel, each piece weighing the same as the sanctuary shekel. And Moses gave the silver for the redemption to Aaron and his sons, just as the Lord had commanded. And I'm thinking at this point he's getting pretty drugged down. We're getting into duties. So we got duties of the Kohathite clan here. And we kind of already have covered that. Duties of the Gershonite clan and duties of the Merarite clan. And then a summary of the registration. So the registration was completed. That would be the registration of the tribe of Levi. And let me look at our time here. We've got a while. The Lord gave these instructions to Moses. Command the people of Israel to remove from the camp anyone who has a skin disease, or in the King James leprosy, or a discharge who has become ceremonial unclean by touching a dead person. This command applies to men and women alike. Remove them so they do not defile the camp in which I live among them. So the Israelites did as the Lord commanded Moses and removed such people from the camp. And that removal continued to the time of Jesus, when people with infectious skin diseases were required to wander the country and not enter the towns and cities and to cry out, "Unclean, unclean," so nobody would come near them. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Give the following instructions to the people of Israel. If any of the people, men or women, betray the Lord by doing wrong to another person, they are guilty. They must confess their sin and make full restitution for what they have done, adding an additional 20%, or 1/5, and returning it to the person who was wronged. But if the person who was wronged is dead and there are no near relatives to whom restitution can be made, the payment belongs to the Lord and must be given to the priest. Those who are guilty must also bring a ram as a sacrifice, and they will be purified and made right, that is, atoned for, with the Lord. All the sacred offerings the Israelites bring to the priest will belong to him. Each priest may keep all the sacred donations that he receives." Protecting marital faithfulness. This is a strange provision And as we read through it, you'll see how strange it is. There is a guy on the internet who interprets this as an order requiring abortion. We'll read through it. I'll let you decide if he's right about that. The Lord said to Moses, "Give the following instructions to the people of Israel. Suppose a man's wife goes astray and she is unfaithful to her husband and has sex with another man, but neither her husband nor anyone else knows about it. She has defiled herself even though there was no witness and she was not caught in the act. If her husband becomes jealous and is suspicious of his wife and needs to know whether or not she has defiled herself, the husband must bring his wife to the priest. He must also bring an offering of 2 quarts of barley flour to be presented on her behalf. Do not mix it with olive oil or frankincense, for it is a jealousy offering, an offering to prove whether or not she is guilty." And as you read this, you're going to say, well, how would that work? Well, I don't think I'm going to offer an opinion on that, but let's go on. The priest will then present her to stand trial before the Lord. He must take some holy water in a clay jar and pour it into dust he has taken from the tabernacle floor. When the priest has presented the woman before the Lord, he must unbind her hair and place in her hands the offering of proof, the jealousy offering, to determine whether her husband's suspicions are justified. The priest will stand before her holding the jar of bitter water that brings a curse to those who are guilty. The priest will then put the woman under oath and say to her, "If no other man has had sex with you and you have not gone astray and defiled yourself while under your husband's authority, may you be immune from the effects of this bitter water that brings on the curse. But if you have gone astray by being unfaithful to your husband and you have defiled yourself by having sex with another man," and at this point the priest must put the woman under oath by saying, "May the people know that the Lord's curse is upon you when he makes you infertile, causing your womb to shrivel and your abdomen to swell." Footnote D, when he causes your thigh to waste away. So there may be an explanation for why they've rendered it that way. And let me just look here at this section of the NIV. Where are we? Chapter 5. Yes. And the NIV just puts it into your body so that your abdomen swells and your thigh wastes away. And that is what this guy is interpreting as the abortion when the womb shrivels. But then that's an interpretation of it. So, and by the way, they have a footnote for the bit about the shrivel. Oh, okay. Yeah, we already read that. And the woman will be required to say, "Yes, let it be so," or "Amen, so let it be." And the priest will write these curses on a piece of leather and wash them off into the bitter water. He will make the woman drink the bitter water that brings on the curse. When the water enters her body, it will cause bitter suffering if she is guilty. The priest will take the jealousy offering from the woman's hand, lift it up before the Lord, carry it to the altar. He will take a handful of the flour as a token portion and burn it on the altar, and he will require the woman to drink the water. If she has defiled herself by being unfaithful to her husband, the water that brings on the curse will cause bitter suffering. Her abdomen will swell and her womb will shrink, and her name will become a curse among her people. But if she has not defiled herself and is pure, then she will be unharmed and will still be able to have children. This is the ritual law for dealing with suspicion. If a woman goes astray and defiles herself while under her husband's authority, or if a man becomes jealous and is suspicious that his wife has been unfaithful, the husband must present his wife before the Lord, and the priest will apply this entire ritual law to her. The husband will be innocent of any guilt in this matter, but his wife will be held accountable for her sin. This sounds to me very misogynistic, but then that was the society and culture that they were in. And if we take it symbolically, then in the rest of the Old Testament, we read how the church is the bride of Christ, or his people are to have an intimate relation with him. like the relationship of marriage. And unfaithfulness in that relationship is problematic because it leads to malformation of character and the presence of sin in the life. And so that then could be what's represented here. And God has used the misogyny of the people to give a metaphor for salvation and for his dealings with the sin problem in this matter. Nazirite laws. This is kind of interesting because some have suggested that Jesus took a Nazirite vow. There were other Nazirites, such as Samson, and so this is the law that applied to them. Did you say something? Or did you go to sleep? I fed her before we started. She may have gone to sleep. If any of the people, either men or women, take the special vow of a Nazirite, setting themselves apart to the Lord in a special way, they must give up wine and other alcoholic drinks. They must not use vinegar made from wine or from other alcoholic drinks. They must not drink fresh grape juice, and they must not eat grapes or raisins. So an entire abstinence from alcoholic beverages and the products used to produce those alcoholic beverages. As long as they are bound by their Nazirite vow, they are not allowed to eat or drink anything that comes from a grapevine, not even the grape seeds or skins. They must never cut their hair throughout the time of their vow, for they are holy and set apart to the Lord. And this is where we gather that Samson had a Nazirite vow because he didn't cut his hair until the incident with Delilah. Until the time of their vow has been fulfilled, they must let their hair grow long, and they must not go near a dead body during the entire period of their vow to the Lord. Even if the dead person is their own father, mother, brother, or sister, they must not defile themselves, for the hair on their head is a symbol of their separation to God. This requirement applies as long as they are set apart to the Lord. If someone falls dead beside them, the hair they have dedicated will be defiled. They must wait for 7 days and then shave their heads. They will be cleansed from their defilement. On the 8th day they must bring 2 turtle doves or 2 young pigeons to the priest at the entrance of the tabernacle or the tent of meeting. The priest will offer one of the birds for sin offering, the other for burnt offering. In this way he will purify them or make atonement for them from the guilt they incurred through contact with the dead body. This is all symbolic, obviously. Then they must reaffirm their commitment and let their hair begin to grow again. The days of their vow that were completed before their defilement no longer count. They must rededicate themselves to the Lord as a Nazirite for the full term of their vow, and each must bring a 1-year-old male lamb for a guilt offering. This is the ritual law for the Nazirites. The conclusion of their time of separation as Nazirites, they must each go to the entrance of the tabernacle and offer their sacrifices to the Lord: a 1-year-old male lamb without defect for a burnt offering, a 1-year-old female lamb without defect for a sin offering, a ram without defect for a peace offering, a basket of bread, unleavened bread, cakes of choice flour mixed with olive oil and wafers spread with olive oil, along with the prescribed grain offerings and liquid offerings, or drink offerings. The priest will present these offerings before the Lord, first the sin offering and the burnt offering, then the ram for peace offering, along with a basket of bread made without yeast. The priest must also present the prescribed grain offering and liquid offering to the Lord. So this is how they delivered themselves from their vow at the end of their term. Then the Nazirites will shave their heads at the entrance of the tabernacle. They will take the hair that had been dedicated and place it on the fire beneath the peace offering sacrifice. After the Nazirite's head has been shaved, the priest will take for each of them the boiled shoulder of the ram. He will take from the basket a cake and a wafer made without yeast. He will put them all into the Nazirite's hands. Then the priest will lift them up as a special offering before the Lord, or a wave offering. These are holy portions for the priest, along with the breast of the special offering and the thigh of the sacred offering. And I just realized that I forgot to switch, so you haven't been able to see what I've been reading. Sorry about that. There it is. This is the ritual law of the Nazirites who vow to bring these offerings to the Lord. They may also bring additional offerings if they can afford it, and they must be careful to do whatever they vowed when they set themselves apart as Nazarites. And now here's a passage that many are familiar with, the priestly blessing. The Lord said to Moses, "Tell Aaron and his sons to bless the people of Israel with this special blessing. May the Lord bless you and protect you. May the Lord smile on you and be gracious to you. May the Lord show you his favor and give you his peace. Whenever Aaron and his sons bless the people of Israel in my name, I myself will bless them." And you may be familiar with that as a musical passage rendered from the King James reading of that text. And here is how that reads, just so you can hear it. "The Lord bless thee and keep thee. The Lord make his face shine upon thee and be gracious unto thee. The Lord lift up his countenance upon thee, and give thee peace." And of course, when it uses thee there, that's the Old English singular rather than plural. So the blessing rendered here in traditional modern English with the plural you, which we also use in the singular, is to be understood as singular. This is a blessing directed towards people individually, not as a group. "Whenever Aaron and his sons bless the people of Israel in my name, I myself will bless them." Offerings of dedication, we may just skip over this. List the offerings in each section is pretty much the same. 5th day, 6th day, 7th day, 8th day, 9th day, 10th day, 11th day, and 12th day. And these offerings come from each of the tribes, so the names of the leaders named there match what's in Numbers chapter 1. This was the dedication offering brought by the leaders of Israel at the time the altar was anointed. And it names them all again. There were silver platters, silver basins, gold incense containers with the weights given there. 12 young bulls, 12 rams, 12 one-year-old male lambs donated for the burnt offerings along with the prescribed grain offerings, 12 male goats, 24 bulls, 60 rams, 60 male goats, 60 one-year-old male lambs, all donated for the peace offerings. This was the dedication offering for the altar after it was anointed. And that's 60 would be 12 times 5, so 5 of each from each of the tribes. And I know that math because where I worked, when I was still working full-time, there were times when they did a 60-hour week. And they did that through 5. Well, you could do that 2 ways. You could do it through 6 10-hour days, but a lot of times in order to get their weekends, the people would opt to do 5 12-hour days. So you would spend half your day at work in order to have a couple of days off over the weekend when production was really high and they were working those 60-hour weeks. Fortunately, those never lasted more than a month or so because that can be very hard on the human frame. Whenever Moses went into the tabernacle to speak with the Lord, he heard the voice speaking to him from beneath the 2 cherubim above the ark's cover, the place of atonement that rests on the ark of the covenant, the ark of the testimony. The Lord spoke to him from there. Preparing the lamps. The Levites dedicated. We can kind of skip over that. The second Passover, that would be 1 year after. So this would have been before the beginning of the book, because it was the first day of the first month would be the Passover, or the 14th day of the first month, rather. Yes, Mia, this is the cat who decided at 10 o'clock that Daddy shouldn't be asleep at 10 o'clock in the morning and came and kneaded his legs, as cats will do. Yeah, we love you, Mia, even though you're a pest. So Moses told the people to celebrate the Passover. Let's see, tell Israel to celebrate the Passover. Yeah, 14th day of the first month. So the numbering at the beginning of the book took place on the first day of the second month. So this is a little bit out of order. They celebrated it there, the first one after the actual thing. It says some of the men had become ceremonially defiled by touching a dead body, so they cannot celebrate the Passover that day. They came to Moses and Aaron that day and said, "We have become ceremonially unclean by touching a dead body, but why should we be prevented from presenting the Lord's offering at the proper time?" No clause, Mia. With the rest of the Israelites, Moses answered, "Wait here till I have received the instructions for you from the Lord." This was the Lord's reply to Moses: "Give the following instructions to the people of Israel. If any of the people now or in future generations are ceremonially unclean at Passover time because of touching a dead body," I mean, you don't just let the body lay there, you got to do it. "Or if they are on a journey and cannot be present at the ceremony, they may still celebrate the Lord's Passover. They must offer the Passover sacrifice 1 month later at twilight on the 14th day of the second month. They must eat the Passover lamb at that time with bitter salad greens and bread made without yeast. They must not leave any of the lamb until the next morning, and they must not break any of its bones. They must follow all the normal regulations concerning the Passover. But those who neglect to celebrate the Passover at the regular time, even though they are ceremonially clean and not away on a trip, will be cut off from the community of Israel. If they fail to present the Lord's offering at the proper time, they will suffer the consequences of their guilt. And if foreigners living among you want to celebrate the Passover to the Lord, they must follow these same decrees and regulations. The same laws apply both to native-born Israelites and to the foreigners living among you. Once again, a sign that God did not take foreign ancestry as a problem. The same for you as it was for the Israelites. On the day the tabernacle was set up, the cloud covered it, but from evening until morning the cloud over the tabernacle looked like a pillar of fire. This was the regular pattern. At night the cloud that covered the tabernacle had the appearance of fire. Whenever the cloud lifted from over the sacred tent, the people of Israel would break camp and follow it, and wherever the cloud settled, the people of Israel would set up camp. In this way they traveled and camped at the Lord's command whenever he told them to go, or wherever he told them to go. Then they remained in their camp as long as the cloud stayed over the tabernacle. If the cloud remained over the tabernacle for a long time, the Israelites stayed and performed their duty to the Lord. Sometimes the cloud would stay over the tabernacle for only a few days, so the people would stay for only a few days, as the Lord commanded. Then at the Lord's command, they would break camp and move on. Sometimes the cloud stayed only overnight and lifted the next morning. But day or night, when the cloud lifted, the people broke camp and moved on. Whether the cloud stayed above the tabernacle for 2 days, a month, or a year, the people of Israel stayed in camp and did not move on. But as soon as it lifted, they broke camp and moved on. So they camped or traveled at the Lord's command. They did whatever the Lord told them through Moses. Now there's footnotes here talk about when these different things happen because of the ancient Hebrew lunar calendar. First month usually occurs within the month of March or April, so the second month would have been April, May, or early June. There we are, Numbers 10. The silver trumpets. Now the Lord said to Moses, "Make 2 trumpets of hammered silver for calling the community to assemble and for signaling the breaking of camp. When both trumpets are blown, everyone must gather before you at the entrance of the tabernacle. But if only one trumpet is blown, then only the leaders, the heads of the clans of Israel, must present themselves to you. When you sound the signal to move on, the tribes camped on the east side of the tabernacle must break camp and move forward. When you sound the signal a second time, the tribes camped on the south will follow. You must sound short blasts as a signal for moving on. But when you call the people to an assembly, blow the trumpets with a different signal. Only the priests, Aaron's descendants, are allowed to blow the trumpets. This is a permanent law for you to be observed from generation to generation. When you arrive in your own land and go to war against your enemies who attack you, sound the alarm with the trumpets. Then the Lord your God will remember you and rescue you from your enemies. Blow the trumpets in times of gladness, too, from sounding them at your annual festivals and at the beginning of each month. And blow the trumpets over your burnt offerings and peace offerings. The trumpets will remind your God of his covenant with you. I am the Lord your God. And then the Israelites leave Sinai and they take off in the order that had been specified. Dan's troops went last, marching behind their banner. This is the order in which the Israelites marched, division by division. One day Moses said to his brother-in-law, Hobab, son of Reuel the Midianite, "We are on our way to the place the Lord promises, for he said, I will give it to you. Come with us, and we will treat you well, for the Lord has promised wonderful blessings for Israel." But Hobab replied, "No, I will not go. I must return to my own land and family." "Please don't leave us," Moses pleaded. "You know the places in the wilderness where we should camp. Come, be our guide. If you do, we'll share with you all the blessings the Lord gives us." Doesn't say whether he did or not. It stops there, huh? They marched for 3 days after leaving the mountain of the Lord, with the ark of the Lord's covenant moving ahead of them to show them where to stop and rest. As they moved on each day, the cloud of the Lord hovered over them, and whenever the ark set out, Moses would shout, "Arise, O Lord, and let your enemies be scattered. Let them flee before you." Who are God's enemies? Well, God's enemies are the sins that beset and destroy his people. That's who he's calling on to be scattered. And when the ark was set down, he would say, "Return, O Lord, to the countless thousands of Israel." And we're going through this quickly because otherwise it's kind of boring. This is more story now, so we'll take a little bit more time with it. We have enough time, I think, maybe to do this one chapter. Soon the people began to complain about their hardship, and the Lord heard everything they said. Well, of course he did. Then the Lord's anger blazed against them, and he sent a fire to rage among them, and he destroyed some of the people on the outskirts of the camp. Then the people screamed to Moses for help, and when he prayed to the Lord, the fire stopped. After that, the area was known as Taberah, which means the place of burning, because fire from the Lord had burned among them there. Then the foreign rabble who were traveling with the Israelites began to crave the good things of Egypt, and the people of Israel also began to complain. "Over some meat," they exclaimed. We remember the fish we used to eat for free in Egypt, and we had all the cucumbers, melons, leeks, onions, and garlic we wanted. But now our appetites are gone. All we ever see is this manna." What was the manna? Manna was the bread of heaven, provided miraculously to them. But they wanted the higher stimulation of the cucumbers, melons, leeks, onions, and garlic, all that spicy stuff. They didn't want the possibly blander manna. They wanted that hyper stimulation. The manna looked like small coriander seeds, and it was pale yellow like gum resin. The people would go out and gather it from the ground. They made flour by grinding with hand mills or pounding it in mortars. Then they boiled it in a pot and made it into flat cakes. These cakes tasted like pastries baked with olive oil. The manna came down on the camp with the dew during the night. Moses heard all the family standing in the doorways of their tents whining. Well, that's what's whining. Whining is a form of manipulation. You make yourself appear piteous, trying to play on the pity of other people to get what you want. And here they are, they're whining. They're being toxic is what they're doing. Moses was also very aggravated. It says the Lord became extremely angry. At the people? No, at the sin. And Moses said to the Lord, "Why are you treating me, your servant, so harshly? Have mercy on me. What did I do to deserve the burden of all these people? Did I give birth to them? Did I bring them into the world? Why did you tell me to carry them in my arms like a mother carries a nursing baby? How can I carry them to the land you swore to give their ancestors? Where am I?" Now Moses is whining, isn't he? "Where am I supposed to get meat for all these people? They keep whining to me saying, 'Give us meat to eat.' I can't carry all these people by myself. The load is far too heavy. If this is how you intend to treat me, just go ahead and kill me. Oh, Moses has really moved into manipulation land here. Do me a favor and spare me this misery. Yeah, that's threatened suicide. That'll get people to sympathize with you. That'll get them to do what you want. It's manipulation. It's toxic behavior, friends. Then the Lord said to Moses, gather before me 70 men who are recognized as elders and leaders of Israel. Bring them to the tabernacle to stand there with you. I will come down and talk to you there. I will take some of the spirit that is upon you, and I will put the spirit upon them also. They will bear the burden of the people along with you, so you will not have to carry it alone. And this appears to parallel the story from the book of Exodus, when Moses' father-in-law came and told him, you can't bear this load by yourself, you need to have some help. And say to the people, purify yourselves, for tomorrow you will have meat to eat. You were whining, and the Lord heard you when you cried over some meat. We were better off in Egypt. Well, no, they weren't, but, the grass is always greener on the other side of the fence. You forget the misery of your condition when you're out of it, and you remember the good stuff. And, and that's the foundations of regressive policy making. Yesterday was better. No, yesterday was not better. It's just how you remember it that's better. Anyway, now the Lord will give you meat and you will have to eat it. And it won't be for just a day or two, or even for 5 or 10 or even 20. You will eat it for a whole month until you gag and are sick of it. For you have rejected the Lord who is here among you, and you have whined to him, saying, why did we ever leave Egypt? But Moses responded, the Lord, there are 600,000 foot soldiers here with me, and yet you say, I will give them meat for a whole month. Even if we butchered all our flocks and herds, would that satisfy them? Even if we caught all the fish in the sea, would that be enough? Then the Lord said to Moses, has my arm lost its power? Now you will see whether or not my word comes true. So Moses went out and reported the Lord's words to the people. He gathered the 70 elders and stationed them around the tabernacle, or the tent of meeting. And the Lord came down in the cloud and spoke to Moses. Then he gave the 70 elders the same spirit that was upon Moses. And when the spirit rested upon them, they prophesied. But this never happened again. I'm not absolutely certain what this term prophesied here meant, but it may be related to ecstatic utterance, and we get that from descriptions later in the story of Saul, when they said he Saul also among the prophets. The Spirit fell upon them, they spoke in some way. The people called it prophesied, and the Spirit came upon these 70 elders. 2 men, Eldad and Medad, had stayed behind in the camp. They were listed among the elders, but they had not gone out to the tabernacle. Yet the Spirit rested upon them as well, so they prophesied there in the camp. A young man ran and reported to Moses, Eldad and Medad are prophesying in the camp. Oh, this is terrible. Joshua, son of Nun, who had been Moses' assistant since his youth, protested, Moses, my master, make them stop. But Moses replied, are you jealous for my sake? I wish that all the Lord's people were prophets, and that the Lord would put his Spirit upon them all, which is our privilege to receive the Spirit. Then Moses returned to the camp with the elders of Israel. Now the Lord sent a wind that brought quail from the sea and let them fall all around the camp. For miles in every direction there were quail flying about 3 feet above the ground. So the people went out and caught quail all that day and throughout the night and all the next day too. No one gathered less than 50 bushels. Wow, yeah. They spread the quail all around the camp to dry. But while they were gorging themselves on the meat, while it was still in their mouths, the anger of the Lord blazed against the people, and he struck them with a severe plague. Or was it possible that these birds were sick and they ate the diseased meat? So the plague that was called So that place was called Kibroth Hattava, which means graves of gluttony, because there they buried the people who had craved meat from Egypt. From Kibroth Hattava, the Israelites traveled to Hazeroth, where they stayed for some time. And this is why, when we ran into it earlier, I suggested that I've read interpretations where they suggest that both the manna and the quail were a daily thing. I don't think the quail were a daily thing. It was a one-time provision at that time. Now we're getting another one-time provision of it. And God demonstrated what his wrath was, what they want. They wanted meat to eat. He gave them meat to eat. He gave them so much meat to eat it made them sick. And some of them died. Graves of gluttony. Yeah. Be careful what you ask for from God. He might let you have it. And, karma's a vicious thing. Saw a video during the night. Some guy wanted to run from state police. He was driving a Lexus, and he was trying to fake out the police by swerving around. He swerved too hard. His car shot off into the median, flipped over, went clear across the opposing lanes of traffic on the interstate, landed off in the ditch on the far side of the highway, and the cops spent about 10 minutes looking for him. He had been thrown from the vehicle, was laying on the ground, had a compound fracture of a leg, and was laying there moaning and groaning. Be careful what you do, the choices you make. They can come back to haunt you and be exceptionally painful. And I think that was kind of the case here. The people begged God for meat until his wrath was aroused. We know what God's wrath is. He gives you what you want. So, he got tired of hearing it. He let them have what they wanted. They gorged themselves until they died of a plague. Who knows the exact mechanism there? They didn't have autopsies and coroners and so forth in those days to know exactly how the people died. They died. It was a plague. It's the terminology they used. And I'm looking that our time is just about up, and we have reached the end of a chapter here. And let's see, that is chapter 11, so we can begin with Numbers chapter 12. What'll be fascinating, I think, is when we get to the story of Balaam. That's told in the book of Numbers a little farther on. In fact, let me just page through it here. Chapter 13, we'll be exploring Canaan. That's kind of an interesting story. There'll be some bit about offerings, the story of Korah, Dathan, and Abiram. That'll be something to explore and to consider what was really going on, the budding of Aaron's staff, duties of priests and Levites. And then we get to the story of Balaam starts, or we get water from the rock in chapter 20, and the bronze snake in chapter 21. We've discussed that in the past. And then chapters 22, 23, and 24, the story of Balaam and his oracles, which are kind of fascinating. So that's what's on tap as we continue making our way through the Old Testament. And so we invite you to join us next week for another Friday night Bible study. And until then, we do say goodbye and God bless.